Socrates lived from 470 to 399 BCE. He was a citizen of Athens, a soldier who fought in the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 405 BCE, and a philosopher whose public examination of moral concepts eventually led to his false conviction for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates never wrote his philosophy down, most likely because his philosophical practice stressed a method of inquiry rather than any conclusions reached by this method. Thus, we are fortunate that Plato and authors like him wrote about Socrates and his method. Sadly, Socrates was put to death for his philosophical practice and the effect it had on the young men who followed him around the city as he examined others for wisdom. Socrates' method will be dealt with more thoroughly in another lecture. However, I want to stress that his method, known today as the Socratic Method, was meant as a way of discovering the truth about what we know and what we don't know. Essentially, the Socratic method is a way of analyzing concepts, beliefs, and statements for logical consistency. This method rightly made Socrates famous among the Athenians and, eventually, the world. And even though Socrates was not the founder of philosophy or philosophical thinking, he helped to turn it toward an inquiry into moral concepts that had a tremendous influence on Plato and later Aristotle. For this course, you will be reading 3 of Plato's dialogues. First is the Euthyphro, which features Socrates meeting with the priest Euthyphro outside the court of Athens. Socrates asks Euthyphro his purpose for visiting the court and finds out that Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates is surprised at this and asks how Euthyphro can be certain he is doing the right thing. This leads to a discussion of piety or holiness and provides a classic example of the Socratic method in action. Socrates wishes to know what Euthyphro supposedly knows about piety because Socrates has been charged with impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. If Socrates can point to newly learned knowledge of what the pious is, perhaps he can show the court that he is not impious as they claim. After a lengthy discussion, Euthyphro gives up on defining piety because Socrates has shown how 3 of his proposed definitions are logically inconsistent with other beliefs Euthyphro holds. Thus, the Socratic method does not end in certain knowledge, but in the certainty that we have no knowledge of what piety is. At least, no knowledge that we can put into words. The next dialogue, the Apology, features Socrates at his trial for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates employs his method when examining Meletus's charges against him, but most of the dialogue is just Socrates presenting his defense in plain-spoken terms. In addition to the formal or more recent charges of his accusers, Socrates mentions ancient charges against him, which is his name for the prejudices people have developed against him over the years as he has practiced his philosophy. The ancient charges, then, are investigating the things beneath the earth and above the sky, and making the weaker argument the stronger. These 2 charges are related to 2 groups of people who were notorious for their ideas and practices. The first group was the natural philosophers that preceded Socrates. For example, Anaxagoras claimed that the sun was a red-hot stone instead of a god. Socrates, because he practiced philosophy, was identified with this type of philosopher who denied the existence of the gods, at least in some cases. The second group was the sophists, who were teachers of rhetoric that traveled around ancient Greece, offering their lessons for a fee. They were frequently seen as people who taught you how to make specious arguments that sounded good, but were actually faulty in some fashion. They taught the art of persuasion and promoted relativism in morality. Protagoras, one of the most famous sophists, taught that man is the measure of all things, of the things that are, that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not. Socrates was identified as a sophist because his method frequently seemed akin to the specious arguments of the sophists. Socrates denies his identification with these 2 groups, as he believes in the gods and does not teach rhetoric for a fee. Rather, he is a devout believer in the gods and only examines other people for their wisdom. The more recent or formal charges brought against Socrates, impiety and corrupting the youth, are quickly disposed of through Socratic method. Meletus is cross-examined by Socrates, and it is found that Meletus claims both that Socrates does not believe in gods and that he believes in the offspring of gods. In addition, Meletus fails to see that it would be harmful to Socrates if he corrupted the youth, because corrupted people in turn corrupt society, and Socrates is a part of society. Meletus also fails to see that even if Socrates corrupted the youth, it would be improper to punish him because it would be unintentional. Thus, he should be instructed as to the proper ways to behave. Socrates' defense was not successful, however, and he was convicted of both charges and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. The final dialogue we will be reading is called the Crito, and its setting is the Athenian jail in which Socrates waited for his execution. One of Socrates' young admirers, Crito, tries to convince him to escape from his jail cell and live in exile. Socrates, however, refuses, claiming that to escape would be to admit his guilt. He also claims that to escape would be to do harm to the city and its laws. Thus, he chooses to stay in Athens and die an honorable death rather than run from his fate at the ripe old age of 70. Socrates' unjust fate lives with us still. He has become a paragon of speaking truth to power. Almost 2,500 years ago, Socrates died, and the world has never quite been the same. Plato, most notably, devised a system of philosophy based on the rigorous practice of the Socratic method. We'll take a closer look at this method in the next video.